What lies beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York? Below the gold vaults exists something most New Yorkers have never heard of. A complete railroad system, sealed and silent in Manhattan's bedrock. A private underground network built exclusively to move money. In 2009, maintenance engineers discovered branching tunnels their blueprints hadn't shown. Track beds remained visible beneath decades of dust. Signal boxes still clung to walls. Someone had built a railroad here, operated it for years, then abandoned it, sealing the evidence behind concrete and institutional amnesia. The Fed confirmed only that historical infrastructure exists. City archives yielded fragments from the 1870s, permit applications, construction contracts, mentions of pneumatic dispatch systems. The tunnels are still there. Surface evidence reveals a network stretching from the East River to Broadway, over 3 miles of passages. And somewhere in that darkness sit the trains themselves. Small locomotives and specialized cars that once moved millions in currency, bonds, and precious metals through the bedrock of capitalism's capital. Walk along Pine Street between William and Pearl, and you'll pass over one of the main arteries without knowing it. 22 feet below your shoes, a tunnel runs east-west, its brick-vaulted ceilings still sound after 140 years. The modern buildings above, glass towers housing hedge funds and trading firms, have no idea what supports their foundations. During the construction of 60 Wall Street in the 1980s, workers broke through into a chamber containing what appeared to be a small switching station. Track switches, their metal still oiled against rust, controlled junctions that had carried no traffic in 70 years. The construction company sealed the breach and continued building. The incident appears in no official reports. Security upgrades after September 11th revealed more fragments. When contractors installed new foundation monitoring systems around the New York Stock Exchange, sensors detected voids where solid earth should have been. Ground-penetrating radar mapped passages running beneath Broad Street, connecting the exchange to buildings that had housed banks and brokerage houses in the Gilded Age. Some of those buildings are gone now, replaced by modern structures, but the tunnels remain, their destinations orphaned by surface demolition. The ventilation system provides the clearest evidence. Scattered across the financial district are iron grates, ornate Victorian-era castings that seem too decorative for modern utility access. Most are painted over, clogged with decades of street debris, ignored by thousands of daily pedestrians. But on certain winter mornings, when temperature differentials are precisely right, steam rises from these grates, not from subway tunnels, which run deeper and farther apart, but from something closer to the surface, something that retains residual warmth despite abandonment. The pattern of grates, when plotted on a map, traces the tunnel network more accurately than any surviving blueprint. Property records tell their own story. Several buildings in the financial district have basement levels that extend unusually deep, 40, 50, even 60 feet below street level, with no clear explanation for the depth. The Bankers Trust building, demolished in the 1960s, had foundation drawings that showed existing tunnel clearance requiring special beam placement. The old Equitable building at 120 Broadway, replaced after a 1912 fire, had sub-basements that connected to conveyance passages whose function the insurance adjusters never quite understood. The Empire building at 71 Broadway, still standing, has a sealed chamber in its lowest level where track rails remain visible, embedded in concrete flooring that was poured over them rather than removing them. Understanding the tunnels requires understanding what Wall Street moved in the 1870s and 1880s. Physical wealth on a scale difficult to imagine today. Before electronic transfers, before checks became universally accepted, before credit cards existed even as concepts, money meant tangible objects, gold coins, silver certificates, engraved bonds, stock certificates on heavy paper. Banks held these items in vaults. Transactions required physical movement of physical objects between physical locations. On busy trading days, millions of dollars in negotiable instruments changed hands, and every dollar had to travel somehow from seller's vault to buyer's vault. The surface streets couldn't handle the load. Lower Manhattan in the 1870s was already among the most congested urban spaces in America. Horse-drawn wagons, pedestrians, street vendors, trolley cars, and private carriages fought for space on narrow streets laid out in Dutch colonial times. Moving valuable cargo through this chaos invited disaster. Robberies were common. In 1869 alone, banks reported 17 separate thefts of securities being transferred between institutions. Worse than theft was simple delay. A transfer that should take 10 minutes could consume hours if the wagon got stuck in traffic, and time meant money with a literalness that modern traders understand only theoretically. Insurance companies, calculating risk premiums for insuring these transfers, had begun refusing coverage or demanding rates so high they threatened to strangle commerce. The newspapers of the era are filled with complaints from bankers. Something had to change. The solution, someone realized, was to go underground, remove the valuable cargo from the chaotic surface, create a dedicated pathway where speed and security could be guaranteed, operate it privately so that confidentiality was assured. The technology existed, railroads were proven, tunneling techniques were well understood, electric lighting and ventilation systems could create workable underground environments. What was needed was will, capital, and secrecy. Wall Street had all three in abundance. Piecing together the construction timeline requires detective work because the builders deliberately obscured their activities. No grand announcements appeared in newspapers. No proud civic ceremonies marked the tunnel openings. The permits that survive in city archives describe foundation improvements and cellar extensions. Technically accurate, but thoroughly misleading. The actual excavation happened behind a screen of legitimate construction projects, with tunnel work conducted simultaneously with and hidden by bank building expansions and street infrastructure upgrades. The most detailed evidence comes from the diary of Thomas Wickham, a civil engineer who worked on the project in 1873 and 1874. His papers, discovered in a Brooklyn estate sale in 1967, describe what he called the underground work, with technical precision but frustrating vagueness about locations and clients. Wickham wrote about excavating through Manhattan schist, the hard bedrock underlying lower Manhattan, using drilling and blasting techniques more common in mining than construction. The work proceeded in sections, with crews working from multiple points simultaneously, from bank basements, from building foundations, from shaft excavations disguised as cistern construction. "We work entirely at night," Wickham noted in April 1873. The excavated material is removed in regular carts during daylight hours, mixed with legitimate construction debris so as to avoid notice. The tunnel advances perhaps 8 feet per week, which seems slow, but Mr. Hewson insists on absolute precision. Every dimension is checked twice. The grade must not vary by more than 1 inch per 100 feet. Alexander Hewson, the project's chief engineer, appears in city directories as a consulting engineer for various banks, but no surviving record explicitly connects him to the tunnels. The construction labor force remains mysterious. Wickham mentions the Irish crews and notes that workers were required to sign agreements promising not to discuss the work. Payment was above market rates, $2.50 per day compared to the typical $1.50 for construction labor, suggesting that silence had a price. The crews apparently worked in isolated sections with no individual team knowing the full extent of the network. Wickham himself admits confusion about the overall layout. "I know my section connects to something to the east and something to the west, but I have never seen either connection completed, nor do I know where they ultimately lead. What they built, in technical terms, was remarkable. The tunnels averaged 7 feet in height and 6 feet in width, barely enough clearance for the small locomotives and cars that would operate within them, but sufficient for the purpose. The tracks used a narrow gauge of 30 inches, allowing tighter curves and smaller rolling stock than standard railroads. Construction quality was exceptional. The brick-vaulted ceilings were laid with such precision that they've survived 140 years without significant deterioration. Ventilation received obsessive attention. Every several hundred feet, vertical shafts rose to the surface, terminating in those ornate grates that still dot the financial district. The shafts served multiple purposes: air circulation, emergency access, and cable routing for the communication systems that would coordinate train movements. Some shafts connected to building basements, allowing direct loading and unloading without surface exposure. Others simply vented to the street, creating the peculiar microclimate that tunnel maintenance workers would later note. Slightly warmer in winter, slightly cooler in summer than the surrounding soil. The drainage system demonstrated equal sophistication. Water infiltration is inevitable in underground construction, especially below Manhattan's water table. The tunnel designers installed a continuous drainage channel along one side of the track bed, sloped to carry water to collection sumps equipped with steam-powered pumps. The pump chambers themselves are small engineering marvels, brick-lined rooms housing machinery that operated automatically, triggered by float valves that started pumps when water reached certain levels. Some of these pumps still exist, their brass fittings green with patina but mechanically sound. Signal systems ensured safety in the darkness. Electric lights, powered by batteries housed in waterproof boxes, marked junctions and switches. A mechanical telegraph system allowed tunnel operators to communicate train positions, using a simple code of bell signals that propagated through the network. The system couldn't prevent collisions through active control. That technology wouldn't exist for decades, but it could prevent them through information, ensuring that only one train occupied any section of tunnel at a time. The trains themselves were custom-built for the unique environment. Photographs are scarce, but a few survive in bank archives and historical society collections. The locomotives were tiny by surface standards, roughly 12 feet long, powered by battery electric motors rather than steam engines. Steam would have been impossible in such confined spaces. The ventilation system, adequate for removing human-exhaled carbon dioxide, couldn't have handled locomotive exhaust. Electric motors, barely 5 years old as a proven technology when the tunnels opened, offered the perfect solution: clean, quiet, controllable. The locomotive's battery packs were massive lead-acid cells, each weighing several hundred pounds, housed in wooden boxes beneath the motor housing. A single charge, according to fragmentary records, allowed roughly 6 hours of operation, sufficient for a full working day given the short distances involved. Charging stations existed at several points in the network, identified in Wickham's diary as power rooms, where the electric machines are serviced. These rooms contain dynamos powered by small steam engines, generating direct current to replenish the locomotive batteries. The cargo cars were equally specialized. Most were small flatbed designs, capable of carrying lockboxes or small safes. The cars lacked sides or roofs. Security came from the sealed tunnel environment rather than physical enclosure. Some cars featured locking mechanisms, allowing them to be sealed before loading and unlocked only at destination, adding another layer of protection against theft by tunnel workers. The cars rode on simple four-wheel trucks, connected by chains rather than couplers, allowing them to navigate the tight curves that characterized the network. Loading and unloading happened in basement chambers specifically designed for the purpose. Banks that connected to the tunnel system built special vault rooms with track access on one side and conventional vault doors on the other. Guards could move cargo from bank vault to tunnel car without ever bringing it to street level. The timing was coordinated by messenger. A bank wanting to send material would notify the tunnel operations center. A car would arrive at the appointed time. Loading would occur, and the car would depart to its destination. The entire transfer might consume 15 minutes compared to hours via surface transport. The operational peak came in the 1880s and early 1890s, when the tunnel system handled hundreds of transfers daily. A typical morning saw locomotives departing from various points in the network, following scheduled routes that connected the major banks and brokerage houses. The New York Clearing House maintained the master schedule, coordinating movements to avoid conflicts and ensure efficient use of the limited track space. The crews who operated this underground railroad remain largely anonymous. Locomotive engineers, called drivers in the few surviving documents, worked 12-hour shifts in nearly complete darkness, navigating by memory and the feeble glow of battery-powered lamps. Track maintenance workers, called walkers, inspected the tunnels daily, checking for water infiltration, loose bricks, or track defects. Security guards, stationed at key junctions and loading points, ensured that only authorized material moved through the system. Communication between surface and tunnel relied on speaking tubes, long pipes running from control points in bank basements down to tunnel chambers, allowing voice transmission without electricity. A dispatcher in the clearinghouse basement could literally shout instructions down a tube to a tunnel junction, and the junction operator would acknowledge by shouting back. The system was primitive but functional, and it worked with surprising reliability for over 2 decades. The cargo manifests, had they survived, none have been found, would reveal the astonishing volume of wealth that moved through these tunnels. On a busy trading day, a single bank might send a dozen shipments to various destinations. Multiply that by the 20 or so institutions connected to the network, and you approach 250 individual transfers daily. The average shipment value, estimated from bank records that mention tunnel transfers, was roughly $50,000, equivalent to about $1.5 million today. Simple arithmetic suggests that on peak days, over $10 million in securities and precious metals move through the tunnels, safely removed from the chaos and dangers of surface streets. The tunnel workers developed their own subculture, as workers in isolated environments invariably do. Wickham's diary mentions the Tunnelmen's Club, an informal association that met in one of the larger chambers after shift changes. What they discussed, what customs they developed, what songs they sang in the echoing darkness, all of this is lost. But the human need for community in challenging circumstances suggests they created something, some way of making the underground labor bearable. The danger was real and constant. Cave-ins, though rare given the quality of construction, did occur. A notation in the New York Clearing House, minutes from 1887, references the incident of March 17th and authorizes payment to the family of the deceased worker. No name appears. The cause of death isn't specified. The amount, $500, suggests the institution valued secrecy over generosity. How many other such incidents occurred, paid out quietly, and never recorded remains unknown. Health effects troubled the tunnel workers. The damp environment encouraged respiratory problems. The darkness affected vision. Men who spent years working underground often developed unusual light sensitivity when emerging to the surface. The constant noise of locomotives in confined spaces damaged hearing. No workers' compensation existed. No safety regulations protected tunnel labor. When men became too sick to work, they were simply replaced. Yet the jobs were coveted. The pay exceeded surface construction wages, and the work offered steady employment year-round, sheltered from weather and immune to the seasonal fluctuations that plagued other industries. Positions were passed from father to son, uncle to nephew. Certain Irish families in the 5 Points and Lower East Side neighborhoods became known as tunnel families, though outsiders didn't understand what that meant. The workers themselves maintained the secrecy that their employers demanded, partly because they were paid to, partly because exclusivity gave them status in their communities. The tunnel system's operators always feared replication. If one network could be built, others could follow. Competing banks, rival clearinghouses, even criminal organizations might construct their own underground passages. The financial district's bedrock could become Swiss cheese, with tunnels crossing, intersecting, or deliberately breaching one another for competitive or nefarious purposes. This never happened, for reasons both practical and financial. The initial construction cost was staggering, somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, based on fragmentary budget documents. This bought perhaps 3 miles of tunnel, meaning the per-mile cost exceeded $300,000, roughly equivalent to building a small railroad on the surface. Only an association of banks pooling resources could afford such investment, and by the time the system was complete, those banks controlled it sufficiently to prevent competitors from building alternatives. The geography helped too. Manhattan's bedrock, while solid once excavated, resists excavation fiercely. The schist that underlies the financial district is among the hardest rock formations in the region. Tunneling through it required expertise, specialized equipment, and time. A bank wanting to build a competing tunnel would have faced years of construction noise, massive dirt removal that couldn't be hidden, and endless coordination with city authorities. The secrecy that had made the original construction possible was increasingly impossible in the 1890s, as city government became more organized and building regulations more comprehensive. There were rumors, of course. Newspaper stories occasionally mentioned underground passages or secret vaults connecting buildings in the financial district. Most people dismiss these as urban legends, the sort of story cities tell themselves. The few who knew the truth, the bankers who controlled the system, the engineers who maintained it, the workers who operated it, had excellent reasons to remain silent. The tunnel's value depended partly on their secrecy. Public knowledge would invite public demands for access, regulation, taxation. Better to keep the whole thing hidden. The beginning of the end came not from failure, but from success. The tunnel system worked so well that it encouraged the development of alternatives that would eventually make it obsolete. By the late 1890s, the success of underground transport in moving securities led banks to reconsider what actually needed to move physically. If you could securely transfer a promissory note through a tunnel, why not transfer the information about that note through a wire? Telegraph and telephone technology, maturing rapidly in the 1890s, offered new possibilities. Instead of moving a physical stock certificate from one bank to another, you could send a telegram confirming the transfer, with both institutions updating their records simultaneously. The physical certificate could remain locked in a vault somewhere, never moving, while ownership changed hands electronically. This was faster than tunnels, cheaper than locomotives, and didn't require maintaining underground infrastructure. The New York Clearing House began experimenting with wire transfers in 1896. The system was primitive by modern standards. Telegraphers sent coded messages confirming transactions. Banks reconciled accounts by telephone. But it worked. By 1900, roughly 30% of interbank transfers happened electronically rather than physically. By 1905, that figure reached 70%. The tunnel system, which had handled hundreds of transfers daily in its peak years, was down to dozens. Maintenance became problematic. The electric locomotives, now 15 to 20 years old, required increasingly frequent repairs. The battery technology had never been reliable. Cells degraded over time, losing capacity and requiring replacement. The tunnels themselves needed constant upkeep. Pumps to be serviced, lights to be replaced, track to be inspected. When usage was high, these costs were justified. As usage declined, they became harder to defend. The decision to cease operations appears to have been made gradually, rather than through any single dramatic choice. Bank records from 1908 to 1912 show declining maintenance budgets for underground facilities. Fewer workers are listed in payrolls. References to tunnel transfers become scarcer. By 1913, the system was essentially abandoned, though no official closure was ever announced. The tunnels were simply no longer used. The locomotives left to sit on their tracks, the ventilation pumps shut down, the lights extinguished. What happened next reveals Wall Street's approach to its own history. When something becomes inconvenient, you seal it up and pretend it never existed. Between 1913 and 1925, as buildings were renovated or replaced, basement connections to the tunnel system were systematically bricked up. Bank vault rooms that had featured track access on one side had those access points filled with concrete and reinforced. The surface ventilation grates remained. Removing them would have required explaining why they existed, but the shafts themselves were often capped below street level. The tunnels themselves were left largely intact. Filling them would have been enormously expensive, requiring thousands of cubic yards of material to be moved underground and placed. Easier to simply seal the access points and let the passages sit empty in the bedrock. The locomotives and cars, too expensive to remove through the narrow access shafts, were abandoned in place. Somewhere beneath Wall Street, they remain, gradually corroding in the damp darkness. Documentation was actively destroyed. In 1922, the New York Clearing House conducted what its minutes describe as a historical records review, during which older materials were disposed of in accordance with retention policies. Whether this was deliberate erasure of tunnel-related documents or simply routine archival maintenance is unclear, but the effect was the same. Information disappeared. Bank archives from the tunnel era are curiously sparse on operational details that must have existed at the time. The few people who still knew about the tunnels in the 1920s and 1930s were aging. The engineers who had designed the system were retired or dead. The workers who had operated it had moved on to other jobs or other cities. The bankers who had commissioned it were being replaced by new generations who had never known the system existed. Institutional memory faded, and, with it, the tunnels slipped from known history into rumor and legend. By the 1950s, when the financial district underwent massive redevelopment, construction crews occasionally broke through into the old tunnels and reacted with confusion rather than recognition. Unknown void discovered during excavation appears in several construction reports from that era. The voids were noted, sometimes photographed, then sealed up and forgotten again. Nobody connected these isolated discoveries into a comprehensive picture of what lay beneath their feet. Today, the complete extent of the tunnel system remains unmapped. The fragments we know about, the sections discovered during construction, the basement connections still visible in older buildings, the ventilation grates that can be plotted on maps, hint at a network that was larger and more sophisticated than anyone currently realizes. Ground-penetrating radar studies, when conducted, reveal anomalies consistent with void spaces. But the bedrock's density makes definitive mapping difficult. The locomotives and cars are down there somewhere, rusting but likely still recognizable. The battery packs have presumably degraded into puddles of sulfuric acid and lead oxide. The wooden car frames may have rotted or might remain preserved in the stable underground environment. The track itself, steel rails embedded in concrete, will outlast everything else, ready to carry trains that will never come. Questions multiply faster than answers. How many miles of tunnel actually exist? Were there branches and extensions that never made it into even the fragmentary records that survive? Did the system connect to anything else? To subway tunnels, to building foundations, to other underground infrastructure? Who holds the original blueprints, if they still exist anywhere? And why has no bank, no historical society, no city agency ever conducted a systematic study of what lies beneath one of the world's most valuable pieces of real estate? The financial district above continues its work, trillions of dollars changing hands daily through electronic networks that are the spiritual descendants of those underground tunnels. The basic impulse remains unchanged: move value safely and quickly from one point to another, isolated from the chaos and dangers of the public realm. What changed was the substrate. From rails to wires to fiber optics to pure information. But the first step in that evolution, the physical manifestation of Wall Street's desire to move wealth through private channels, remains buried and largely forgotten. Every day, hundreds of thousands of people walk across those streets, completely unaware that beneath their feet lies a complete railroad system, sealed and silent, with trains still sitting on tracks they'll never travel again. The tunnels are arguably one of New York's most significant engineering achievements and certainly among its least known. They represent a moment when financial institutions possessed enough power to reshape the physical city to serve their needs, and enough secrecy to do so without public knowledge or consent. The mystery endures not because evidence doesn't exist, but because those who encounter the evidence lack context to understand what they've found, and those who have context lack access to the evidence. Somewhere in a bank vault, in a historical society storage room, in a descendant's attic, documents probably survive that would illuminate the full story. But finding them requires knowing what to look for, and knowing what to look for requires already understanding the story. The tunnels remain trapped in a loop of historical obscurity, their own secrecy preventing their rediscovery. Perhaps that's fitting. Wall Street built these tunnels to keep its operations private, to move its wealth away from public eyes. They succeeded so well that the tunnels themselves vanished from public knowledge, becoming perhaps the only infrastructure project in American history to operate for decades and then disappear without anyone noticing. The ultimate irony, the financial district's most tangible monument to its own power, is one that almost nobody knows exists.